Denison House. The mighty, mighty Denison House. Everywhere we go, the people want to know who we are and what we do. So we tell them.
It's a settlement house that has gone through the changes to become a general community center.
I figure that's a place to eat lunch when you don't have lunch at school, and that's a good place to play at.
The Denison House gives the kids a chance to dream and experience, and hopefully later on in life they'll go on with those dreams and experiences.
No, a children's daycare, Dumbo. Not a Dumbo. Elephant. African boogie.
And it offers all of us in this work a chance to understand how, first of all, you develop a consensus with different groups. It helps us understand Haitian, Puerto Ricans, Portuguese.
Denison House was founded in 1892 by recent graduates of elite women's colleges in New England. According to one of its founders, Vida Scudder,
Denison House sprang from a conviction that the conditions of life forced by our civilization upon vast numbers of the working classes, especially on the poor in our great cities, are undemocratic, unchristian, unrighteous. In the name of the American democracy, they must be changed.
Vida Scudder was one of the first advocates of the settlement house movement in America. The movement started in England in reaction to the sordid social conditions spawned by the Industrial Revolution. Overcrowded tenement slums, women and children working 14-hour days at hazardous jobs in factories for slave wages, and the utter powerlessness of the masses of laborers. In 1867, a recent graduate of Oxford moved into one of the slums of East London to do social work. He is credited with originating the settlement house idea. The young man's name was Edward Denison.
The year after Denison House opened, an industrial panic spread terrible and bitter unemployment, opening our eyes to the maladjustment of the social order. In consequence, zest for social reform glowed. A workroom for unemployed women was a precursor of many activities now federal in scope. Two friends of the house set up a cooperative tailoress's shop. Denison House took keen interest in all reform movements. Dubbed radical in many quarters, we went our way undaunted. The early leaders of organized labor were our devoted and inspiring friends.
In 1912, there was a major strike in Lawrence, Massachusetts. A new state law had just gone into effect, reducing the hours of labor for women and children from 56 hours to 54 hours a week. The mill corporations responded by reducing wages proportionately and speeding up the machines, thus getting 56 hours of work for 54 hours pay. The workers responded by striking. Two dynamos at Denison House, Vida Scudder and Helena Dudley, supported the strike. This upset the patrons of the settlement house, and they pressured both women into leaving the institution the pair had helped to conceive and manage for 2 decades. This was a major turning point in the history of the Denison House. It spelled the end of its emphasis on social reform. Two of the most active proponents of labor organizing were cut off from the settlement house. Over were attacks at the roots of the deplorable living and working conditions of the factory workers.
Our most important task today is to assimilate the vast numbers of immigrants that come to our shores.
Geraldine Gordon, the woman who replaced Helena Dudley as head worker.
The goddess of liberty, who welcomes the immigrant so dramatically as he sails into the most beautiful of harbors, disappears in the shadows that close upon him in the unfamiliar city streets. The shining beauty of the waterfront belongs to the America of his dreams. A dingy, crowded tenement in a shabby quarter of the town forms the actual environment of his new life.
Located in the South Cove of Boston, Denison House was part of such an environment. So was a child named Khalil Gibran. In later years, Khalil would be acclaimed far and wide for his drawings and writings. But in 1895, an artistic career was unlikely for the son of recent immigrants from Lebanon. Of Khalil, a resident volunteer at the Denison House, wrote,
"His future will certainly be that of a street fakir if something is not done for him at once. The family are horribly poor and will insist upon having some financial assistance from this little boy just as soon as the law will allow, unless he is on the road to something better. Next year he will be 14, beyond the school age, so we are especially interested to start the little fellow this year in his drawing. He is capable of someday earning his living in a better way than by selling matches or newspapers on the street, if someone would only help him get an artistic education."
These words were written to Fred Day, a photographer on the avant-garde, seen here posing as Jesus Christ. With his great aesthetic sensibilities and many connections in artistic circles, Day helped Khalil get that artistic education the Denison House started. Early in the 1970s, Denison House began observing the Kwanzaa, the African feast of the harvest. This annual tradition helps fulfill a major objective of this community center.
We want to encourage the Spanish-speaking people to identify with their culture. We want black people to identify with their culture.
John Bartholomew, presently the executive director of the Federated Dorchester Neighborhood Houses, of which Denison House is one.
And we understand that society really isn't a melting pot, that it's a mosaic and we all have to fit together.
Emphasizing cultural identity is not a new idea at Denison House. Its value was well known to the founders of the settlement. They encouraged immigrants to celebrate their traditions, particularly in the arts. For instance, in 1917, they sponsored a folk arts festival called The Gifts of the Nations, about which this poem was written. Today we come with laughter and with song. To show you what they are, these gifts we fling gladly before you.
Syria will bring her hospitality, whereon to build the brotherhood of nations.
Greece comes filled with joy and beauty, beauty that shall dare to blossom in thy soil, America, to teach the arts more varied and fair.
And who is this that moves amid the throng, but Italy, who through the ages dark held to her sheltering breast that precious spark of life, the Mother Church.
Last, Ireland's way blossoms with songs and laughter ringing gay.
So friends, let us hold festival today.
Enjoy our fete, be joyful if you may.
And know and love us better, so we pray.
In addition to celebrating ethnic identity, events like these were fundraisers. Being a privately funded agency throughout its history, Denison House has always depended on financial support from the community. During the 20s and 30s, many fundraising strategies were used. The board of directors cultivated numerous benefactors. The children and staff put on plays, some of which were performed in prominent downtown theaters. Popular artists and other well-known people donated their talents for the benefit of Denison House. One was Amelia Earhart, who occasionally advertised fundraising events by flying over Boston. She was also a salaried staff worker in 1928, the year of her historic flight across the Atlantic.
In those days, I was at Denison House, one of America's oldest social settlements.
Phone for you, Miss Earhart.
Tell him I'm busy. At the moment, I was the center of an eager swarm of Chinese and Syrian children, piling in for games and classes.
Says it's important.
So I excused myself and went to listen to a man's voice asking me whether I was interested in doing something dangerous in the air. At first I thought the conversation was a joke and said so, but the frank admission of risk stirred my curiosity. References were demanded and supplied, good references. An appointment was arranged for that evening.
Would you like to fly across the Atlantic?
My reply was a prompt yes.
The flight was made, and Amelia came back to Boston to tell about it, for the benefit of Denison House, of course. Shortly after having been catapulted into fame, she left the employ of the settlement, but continued to help raise money for it occasionally. Thanks to the generosity of people like Amelia Earhart and the board of directors, the Denison House community has had access to property in the country since 1905. By 1931, property in Georgetown, Mass. had been purchased.
Farm country is where we came from, so that when we came here, living in the city was kind of frustrating. There was no ground, there was no trees, it was all pavements and city streets and things like that.
Carol Khalil, who frequented Denison House as a child during the 30s.
Camp became very important to me. They had a camp, it was called Georgetown.
The best part I like about the Denny is in the summer. We go to high places, we go to Georgetown, we spend a night over there. The girls sleep up on top of the cabin, and the boys sleep on the bottom. And they tell us spooky stories, and you can see the Big Dipper.
We had a wonderful time at the camp. It was all the neighborhood kids that got to go. Those that could pay, those that didn't, couldn't, went with a sort of a subsistence from somebody else. I don't know how they arranged it, but most of us went to camp.
And many kind of animals, snakes, they teach you about camp, about animals, woods, nature, and don't litter, how you can help not littering. So if you go there, they teach you a lot of stuff, see?
And this was a 2 weeks vacation that you couldn't replace with anything. The trees and the lake and the flowers and new foods. They cooked American food, and we never were exposed to that. It's the first time I ever had Jell-O.
And you can go off and do a lot of things. And you can go and swim in Georgetown. And they got kissing fishes, and they kiss you. But they hurt. They don't hurt, but they kiss. They like suck you. Yeah, they're real. When you go over there, you get to meet a lot of instrument people.
During the 30s, the Syrians and Lebanese began leaving the South Cove area, just as the Irish, the Italians, and the Greeks had done before them. But, unlike before, the number of new people moving in was smaller than the number moving out. This was due primarily to urban redevelopment projects, which ultimately resulted in 93 Tyler Street, the original site of the Denison House, developing into a parking lot. Long before this happened, the board of directors saw the writing on the wall, or rather, the red line on the map. They called for a detailed study of the community. It confirmed their suspicion that the Denison House was no longer needed in the South Cove. The population was shrinking, and there were enough other social service agencies to provide for the people who remained. Each number on this map represents a social service agency. Number 1 is Denison House. In December 1941, programs on 93 Tyler Street were terminated. The question then was what community it should move to and what role it should play there. The board quickly selected the Roxbury North Dorchester area, but was reluctant to specify a role, preferring to feel the new community out. Instead of designing or buying a facility, several existing ones in the area were rented, including schoolyards, playgrounds, a private home, and Firehouse Number 12. While running this decentralized program, the staff learned about the community's needs and desires and gradually determined what role the Denison House should play in it. In 1945, it was decided to buy and renovate the Howard Avenue School. The facility was officially opened in 1949. Meanwhile, children were enjoying Denison House regardless of the facility, at least according to Barbara Stenton.
When I became 14, then a lot of the kids in the neighborhood said, "Oh, come on, let's go. The Denison House has a dance in the schoolyard." And they stamp your hand, and there's Cokes, and there's jukebox and records, sometimes a disc jockey, and for 50 cents you had the grandest party of life in the fresh air under the stars.
Like many people involved with Denison House as a child, Barbara resumed her involvement when she had children of her own. Family camp was a favorite activity of hers.
At night, when the children would be asleep, we'd play cards. We'd go up to the lodge when the children were up, and we'd put on shows, and we'd pop popcorn, have the fireplace on, have sing-alongs.
During the 60s, the community served by Denison House changed tremendously once again. Many white, mostly Irish Catholic, families moved away and were replaced first by Afro-Americans, then Puerto Ricans, Cape Verdeans, and Haitians.
Ho, 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 Hosanna, ha, ha, hallelujah. He saved me. I got the joy, Lord. I got the joy, I got the joy, I got the joy, Lord. Can I do another one? You can't make me down here, I know too much. You can't make me down here, I know too much. Too much about goodness, too much about love. You can't make me down here, I know too much.
Well, in Halloween, I had a King Kong outfit and a devil behind me, the mask. So, we entered a contest, a Halloween contest. So I put on a wig, a lady's wig, and my King Kong suit. So I went downstairs where we play hockey. I was the funniest person. I would go like a monkey, and I won the funniest person. I was King Kong's mom.
In September 1975, there was a fire which forced Denison House to leave the old Howard Avenue school and relocate again. The move was expected to be temporary, just long enough for the fire damage to be repaired. So a small facility, far from adequate, was moved into for the interim. The interim has lasted 5 years. All hope of returning to the old Howard Avenue school is gone, and once again, Denison House is exploring with the community what it needs for Denison House to be. One thing's clear, it needs to be bigger.
We've got kids hanging out the windows.
Melvin Davis, supervisor of child care.
We just have too many kids in too little space.
In addition to increasing recreational facilities for children, the Uphams Corner community needs better housing. Housing was a primary concern of the founders of Denison House.
The settlement worker knows that the immigrant does not create these unrighteous housing conditions. He has to accept them because such a tenement is all his wages can afford. Moreover, it is an American landlord who accepts rent from him for the privilege of living in a rat trap of a house.
An excerpt from the report of the Denison House head worker in 1917.
I see the Denison House basically as an agency which serves as sort of a catalyst to try to bring community groups together around various issues in Uphams Corner.
Art Stanley, the program director at Denison House.
Things like housing or recreation, crime.
Meanwhile, in the real world,
Dennis House, 1, 2, 3. Got me a new tie. Got me a new tie.
He tapes you though.
So, what do you mean? Mixed up with eyeballs, mixed up with meatballs, mixed up with spoogus knife, mixed up with your nose, mixed up with the wax in your ears, and your tongue. You're mixed up with everything except your body. That is not true.